Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Thursday, 4 September 2025. On Monday, the 4th of September in AD 476, 1,549 years ago today, the last Roman emperor in the West, Romulus Augustulus, abdicated in favor of Odoacer, leader of the German foederati in Italy. Romulus Augustus was only about 15 years old at the time, so we can be pretty confident that he wasn't the one calling the shots. So, who was calling the shots? Well, Odoacer for one. Presumably also some senior members of the Senate were involved. But what have historians had to say about this episode? Edward Gibbon had famously set himself the task, as he put it, of, quote, writing the decline and fall of the city, unquote. And to that end, this episode would seem to be of particular significance for Gibbon, who tells the story in his typical style. Gibbon wrote in chapter 36 of the history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, quote, royalty was familiar to the barbarians, and the submissive people of Italy was prepared to obey, without a murmur, the authority which he should condescend to exercise as the vice-regent of the emperor of the West. But Odoacer had resolved to abolish that useless and expensive office, and such is the weight of antique prejudice that it required some boldness and penetration to discover the extreme facility of the enterprise. The unfortunate Augustulus was made the instrument of his own disgrace. He signified his resignation to the Senate, and that assembly, in their last act of obedience to a Roman prince, still affected the spirit of freedom and the forms of the constitution. An epistle was addressed by their unanimous decree to the Emperor Zeno, the son-in-law and successor of Leo, who had lately been restored after a short rebellion to the Byzantine throne, unquote. Gibbon cites Malchus of Philadelphia, an anonymous fragment, and Candidus the Isaurian, which are known today only in fragments, as the sources for this passage. And these fragments are only known because of their inclusion in the Bibliotheca of Photius, an ecumenical patriarch of Constantinople in the 9th century A.D., and subsequently known as Saint Photius the Great. There are also fragmentary accounts in John of Antioch, Jordanes, and Cassiodorus. The fact that events of this magnitude are so poorly documented is a testament to how much Rome had already deteriorated by the time Odoacer took the city. The primary source material is fragmentary, and what survives gives us little to work with. A modern translation of the fragments of Malchus can be found in The Fragmentary Classicizing Historians of the Later Roman Empire by R.C. Blockley, who translated this as, quote, when Augustus, the son of Orestes, heard that Zeno had driven out Basilicus and regained the sovereignty of the East, he compelled the Senate to send an embassy to Zeno, proposing that there was no need of a divided rule and that one shared emperor was sufficient for both territories. They said, moreover, that they had chosen Odoacer, a man of military and political experience, to safeguard their own affairs, and that Zeno should confer upon him the rank of patrician and entrust him with the government of Italy. Representatives of the Roman Senate arrived at Byzantium carrying these proposals, unquote. And note that there is more than one spelling for Odoacer and more than one pronunciation. I'm using primarily the one that's familiar to me, Odoacer, but in that passage it's been translated as Odoacer. In any case, Malchus of Philadelphia gives us an obviously Byzantine perspective on events, which is exactly what we would expect from a Byzantine source. As with Gibbon, this account by Malchus makes it sound like Romulus Augustulus had the agency of a full-grown man engaging with complex diplomatic niceties that no child of 15 could understand. We could cite the example of Alexander the Great, who took power at the age of 20 after Philip II of Macedon was assassinated by one of his bodyguards, and then went on to conquer the Persian Empire. But Romulus Augustulus was no Alexander. He was called Augustulus because this was a diminutive form of Augustus, like you'd add Y to the end of a child's name as a form of endearment. We find an account with different emphases in Jordanes, a minor official in a minor province in the Balkans. Jordanes had been asked to write a summary of a longer work by Cassiodorus, and since the work by Cassiodorus has since been lost, we don't know how heavily Jordanes relied on it and how much he introduced of his own point of view. Jordanes was himself a Goth, and in his Origins and Deeds of the Goths, as the work was translated in the early 20th century by Charles C. Miro, nicely places the whole episode in its historical context. Quote, when Augustulus had been appointed emperor by his father Orestes in Ravenna, it was not long before Odoacer, king of the Torsalingui, invaded Italy as leader of the Siri, the Heruli, and allies of various races. He put Orestes to death, drove his son Augustulus from the throne, and condemned him to the punishment of exile in the castle of Lucullus in Campania. Thus the Western Empire of the Roman race, which Octavianus Augustus, the first of the Augusti, began to govern in the 709th year from the founding of the city, perished with this Augustulus in the 522nd year from the beginning of the rule of his predecessors and those before him. And from this time onward, kings of the Goths held Rome and Italy. Meanwhile, Odoacer, king of nations, subdued all Italy, and then at the very outset of his reign slew Count Brasilla at Ravenna that he might inspire a fear of himself among the Romans. He strengthened his kingdom and held it for almost 13 years, even until the appearance of Theodoric, of whom we shall speak hereafter. Unquote. If Jordanes is to be believed, and many have been skeptical of his work, Romulus Augustulus was unceremoniously deposed and exiled, whereas some accounts make it sound like he had voluntarily stepped down. By Jordanes' reckoning, the Roman Republic had followed by the empire endured together for 1,231 years, and had all perished with the fall of Romulus Augustulus. So was the fall of Romulus Augustulus also the fall of Rome? Was that the end of the Western Roman Empire? Well, Gibbon's history, which was supposed to tell the story of the fall of Rome, doesn't suddenly cut off with the fall of Romulus Augustulus. Chapters 37 and 38 of the history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire could fairly be called summary chapters. And in chapter 38, Gibbon wrote, quote, I have now accomplished the laborious narrative of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire from the fortunate age of Trajan and the Antonines to its total extinction in the West about 5 centuries after the Christian era. Unquote. Still, Gibbon didn't end it at this point, but he went on to write the entire history of Byzantium to the fall of the Roman Empire in the East. Odoacer's deposition of Romulus Augustulus in 476 is the date most commonly given as the end of the Roman Empire in the West, but it's not the only date that's given. Many historians have pointed out that the average Roman living in Rome on this date wouldn't have noticed any change at all in his circumstances on that day, and certainly wouldn't have remembered the date as the fall of the Roman Empire. It's much more likely that Romans who had lived through the sack of Rome in AD 410 would have thought of that as the collapse of the Roman Empire. But there would have been few alive in 476 who would have remembered this earlier catastrophe. It was, after all, the sack of Rome that inspired St. Augustine to write his City of God, and which inspired another church father, St. Jerome, to write, quote, when the bright light of all the world was put out, or rather, when the Roman Empire was decapitated, and so to speak more correctly, the whole world perished in one city, unquote. And in another place he wrote, quote, if Rome can perish, what can be safe, unquote. In this sense, the date of 476 is symbolic, and the event that occurred was essentially a legal event. The reign of the Western Roman Empire ended and was replaced by Odoacer as King of Italy. King, not emperor. Recent historians of many different schools of thought have shifted to emphasizing the continuity in the Western Roman Empire during this transition from Roman power proper to the effective administration of German tribal chieftains. Part of this is due to the influence of the Purin thesis, which held it was the rise of Islam and not the deposition of Romulus Augustulus that spelled the end of empire in the West. But that wasn't the only motivation. Part of it is what we could call pure cussedness on the part of historians. Once it became the received wisdom of historiography that AD 476 was the date on which the Roman Empire fell, it was inevitable that there would be a reaction against this common wisdom. The Annales historians, who emphasize the longue durée, are especially associated with the recognition of the economic and technological continuity that underlie ephemeral events, of which we could call the deposition of Romulus Augustulus such an ephemeral event. But at the same time, taking the view of the longue durée, we would also want to divide history into macro-historical periodizations, one of which would be the Roman period in the West. And to identify this as a period, we have to identify a beginning and an end to the period. Our choice of a date for the end of the Roman period is, to a certain extent, conventional. We can choose AD 476 or some other date before or after this with plausible reasons provided. If you prefer, you can say that the last Roman emperor was Julius Nepos. Nepos was, after all, recognized as legitimate by the Eastern emperor. And if we take Nepos to be the last emperor in the West, then the Western Empire ended when Nepos was murdered on 9 May in AD 480. Any dates that's proposed as the definitive end of the Western Empire inevitably is going to be contested. Just as there's been a lot of pushback against the date of 476 for the end of the Western Roman Empire, there's also been pushback against calling the Eastern Roman Empire Byzantine. While it's true that the Byzantines called themselves Romans to the end, they called themselves Romans much in the same way that the Holy Roman Empire called itself Roman. The empire endured in Byzantium, but Roman civilization did not endure. Roman civilization failed in the West, while in the East it gave way before a new civilization that was Christian, Greek-speaking, and centered on Constantinople. Roman civilization was pagan, Latin-speaking, with social life centered around public baths and games, and its political life centered on Rome. Byzantine civilization endured as long as Rome itself had endured, and perhaps a bit longer, depending on what dates we choose to go with for the beginning and the end, as these dates are as hotly contested as the dates for Rome itself. History is always a complicated and messy business, and there's always another story to tell that puts familiar stories we know in a new light. We trim away the messiness of history when we turn it into a narrative, and there's more than one way to extract a narrative out of the messiness of history. For example, we can take different perspectives on the same events, valuing them differently or finding different meanings in them, as we find in the contrasting accounts of Malchus of Philadelphia and of Jordanes. In the framework of Hayden White's meta-history, we can variously implot the same events as romance, tragedy, comedy, or satire. In fact, if you like, as a thought experiment, you could imagine an ancient play written on the deposition of Romulus Augustulus by Odoacer, implotted as a romance, implotted as a tragedy, implotted as a comedy, or as a satire. And we can make a different selection of events to include in history, which is again a function of how we value events, how we judge an event to be of historical importance or not sufficiently important to include it in a history. And we can do all of these things at the same time. Most notoriously, we can trim away the messiness of history with cyclical history. That empires rise and fall is the simplest embodiment of the idea of cyclical history. In a grand cyclical history, the fall of Rome is but one of many empires that have risen and fallen in its turn. The rise and fall of empires is, as it were, the respiration of history. Even those who have no particular interest in cyclical history won't dispute that history is a long record of the rise and fall of societies, but this is what we could call a very low-resolution way to look at history. And when we look at historical events in a higher degree of resolution, their differences may interest us more than their similarities. We can take the fall of Rome as just one of several failed empires throughout history, but that's not how we see it as Westerners. We aren't as troubled over the many civilizations that were swept away by the late Bronze Age collapse, or by Alexander's defeat of Persia, or the long decline of Egypt, and we may even be relieved in a peculiar ancestral way about the fall of the Mongol Empire or the end of Tamerlane's empire. But Western civilization is perpetually haunted by the collapse of the Roman Empire. Here was a civilization that endured for a millennium, ruled the known world, provided its population with peace and an enviable standard of living, and scaled the heights of civilized achievement, leaving us with a tradition of law that still distinguishes Western civilization. And interestingly enough, we know Roman law through Byzantium, since it was the Corpus Iuris Civilis drawn up by the order of Justinian I that has come down to us as a definitive statement of Roman law. There's nothing more melancholy or more poetic than the fall of Rome, and the ruins of once grand public buildings have been irresistible to artists ever since. Gibbon wrote a long book about it, from which I've already quoted, and in our own time, Pocock wrote an even longer book about Gibbon writing his book. We're haunted by the fall of Rome because it's part of our history as Westerners. Classical antiquity, culminating in the civilization of Rome, was the first act in the three-act play of Western civilization, ancient, medieval, and modern. A perfectly ordered story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. Seen in this way, with Rome as the beginning, the collapse of Rome was the end of the beginning, and the beginning had to end for the rest of the story to unfold. This sequence of ancient, medieval, and modern civilization is an idealized conception of history. Idealized not in the sense of being an ideal to which we aspire, not a moral ideal of any kind, but idealized in the sense of being an abstraction from the messiness of history, chamfering the square edges and rounding off the corners, just as the concepts of science are an abstraction from the messiness of the natural world. In my episode on Alexandre Koyré, I quoted Koyré as saying that good physics is made a priori. Could we also say that good history is made a priori? Koyré's Platonism is controversial enough in natural science, but it's almost unthinkable in history. But his point remains. And as Koyré said of experimentation, that, quote, it is not by following experiment, but by outstripping experiment that the scientific makes progress. Could we also say that the historical mind should outstrip history? Today, we're more likely to call this the underdetermination of theory by evidence, which sounds much less tendentious, and is how Quine framed it. And we've accepted this as an unavoidable feature of scientific theories. Of course, there's no experiment in the usual sense in history, but there is the confrontation of a theory with evidence sought out specifically for the purpose of confirming or disconfirming an explanation, and that's essentially what an experiment is in the natural sciences. For historical explanation to outstrip historical evidence, as Koyré says that natural science makes progress when empirical science outstrips empirical evidence, We would expect to see the underdetermination of historical theory by historical evidence. Formally, it's easy to see why this is the case. From any theory, we can derive an infinitude of theorems, and any effort to demonstrate these theorems with evidence must fall short because we're finite beings with finite minds. I've learned a lot more about Koyré's thought since I recorded the episode on his work, and I've thought about producing an addendum on Koyré, but I still need to work through the additional materials I've gathered so as to understand his distinctive conception of logical paradoxes. This is going to take me some time, but Koyré's central historical theme of the medieval world being closed and finite and giving way to a modern world that's open and infinite remains as a framework we can employ. That is to say, a theory likely to be underdetermined in the light of historical evidence, but nevertheless a framework from which we can derive an infinitude of consequences that suggest historical interpretations. We find something like Koyré's closed world and infinite universe in the last chapter of Aldo Schiavone's The End of the Past, Ancient Rome, and the Modern West. The final chapter is titled How History Works, and in it, Schiavone wrote of the consummate maturity of the ancient world, and that it couldn't change without obliterating the configuration it had assumed. In this idea of consummate maturity, there's an echo of Johan Huizinga, whose famous history of late medieval Europe, the autumn of the Middle Ages, presents the civilizations of the Low Countries as having achieved a unique maturity and refinement as the fulfillment of medieval civilization. And this kind of fulfillment has been rare in history because aged civilizations are usually rudely swept aside by new developments. Schiavone wrote of ancient Rome, quote, every path not leading to ruin was now definitively blocked, unquote. He called this an impasse in history and said that nothing could be seen that was not its own closure. This is the closed world that Koyré discussed in medieval terms, displaced into ancient history. Schiavone wrote, quote, the finite was everywhere. There were limits in every direction, valleys and walls, immensity, but in a fixed form. Moreover, what else was the irresistible ancient inclination to conceive of history in terms of cycles, if not an expression, almost metaphysical, of the idea of the insuperability of boundaries, limits, and endings, unquote. Coupling the finitude of the classical world with a cyclical conception of history is something that would be worth following up on in more detail, but I'll save this for another time. We could say of Byzantine civilization what Schiavone said of the Roman Empire in the West, that it had achieved a consummate maturity, but this very maturity meant it couldn't change without obliterating the configuration it had assumed. Roman civilization in the West collapsed spectacularly, but that collapse proved to be a discontinuity and not an extinction. A larger social and cultural framework survived and continued to develop. The Weltanschauung of medieval Europe, as represented by its philosophical thought, was dominated by Aristotle, for example, an ancient Greek. Even comparatively, Aristotle was probably more important to medieval thought than even St. Augustine. Ancient Roman architecture was more influential on the built environment of medieval civilization than the vernacular architecture of the indigenous peoples of Europe. In the Eastern Empire, the transition from Roman civilization to Byzantine civilization was continuous, just as 1,000 years later in Western Europe, the transition from medieval civilization to modern civilization was continuous. If we deny that Byzantine civilization represents something distinct from Roman civilization, then by the same token, we ought to deny that modern Western civilization is distinct from medieval civilization, giving the many continuities that we can demonstrate between these periods. When one civilization is continuously transformed into another civilization, there is no collapse and no radical historical discontinuity. On the other hand, when a civilization collapses, that collapse defines a discontinuity. But while discontinuity is a boundary, it isn't necessarily a limit. Byzantium, the transformation of Roman civilization in the East, failed without issue when it did fail. That is to say, it experienced discontinuity that was also extinction. 1453 was a boundary that was also a fatal limit, revealing the finitude of Byzantium. Schiavone observes that the pervasive finitude of ancient Rome, quote, lacked new scopes and distinct objectives to pursue, unquote. Here we have an echo of Spengler, who characterized the ancient world as being that of Apollonian man, who valued order, harmony, proportion, and finitude, whereas the modern West is the world of Faustian man, who is always striving toward the infinite. Schiavone doesn't mention Huizinga or Spengler, but we find these overarching historical themes among those trying to understand history at the largest scales. We could call these different ways of conceptualizing the same thing equivalent constructions, following Hilary Putnam in his Philosophy of Logic. Putnam says that, quote, none of these approaches should be regarded as more true than any other, unquote. I would go farther, and I would say that the ability to formulate a scientific research program of the requisite degree of abstraction in history demands that we overcome the jargon that separates us and recognize that we can put together a puzzle with pieces variously supplied by Alexandre Koyré, Oswald Spengler, Johan Huizinga, and Aldo Schiavone. We may not yet be in a position to complete the puzzle, since all the pieces aren't yet before us, but we can begin to see the picture that the finished puzzle will eventually display. Schiavone goes on to make two more remarkable statements in this final chapter of his book, without showing how they are related to each other. He says, quote, modernity is infinity that has become history, unquote. I can imagine Spengler saying the same thing. Faustian man is infinity become history. And then a paragraph further on, Schiavone writes, quote, if hope is the perception of the infinite, if it is the discovery of how the unlimited possibilities of our species emerge in history through a series of trials and experiments, sometimes the work of the historian can come close to it, unquote. But if hope is the perception of the infinite, and modernity is infinity become history, then hope is the perception of history. And this, I think we'll see, with a bit of reflection, is quite a radical conclusion. Hegel called history a slaughter bench. Before Hegel, Gibbon had observed that, quote, history is little more than the register of the crimes, follies, and misfortunes of mankind, unquote. And Russell quoted this Gibbon line with something like a confirmation of repressed misanthropic bile. But if hope is the perception of history, at least the perception of the history of Faustian man, infinitely striving in an open universe, when then the slaughter bench and the crimes aren't the whole story. They aren't even the center of the story. They're epiphenomenal to history. It's hope that takes center stage. When the closed world was continuously transformed into the open world, the finite world continuously transformed into the infinite world, we gained a future. And with the future before us, we could hope as if hope mattered. And that may be new in history. Thanks for listening. And on a final note, I'm going to be headed to Europe on the 9th of September. I'll be gone for the rest of the month, coming back 30th of September. Last time I traveled in May, I didn't make any videos while traveling, but this time I'm planning on taking a microphone with me. So if I have the quietude of mind and the ability to focus, I hope to make a video or two while I'm traveling. But Time will tell.